But Paul Brennan was still alive, and he had not forgotten. While James was, with astonishing success, building a life for himself in hiding, Brennan did everything he could to find him. That is to say, he did everything that, under the circumstances, he could afford to do. The thing was, the boy had got clean away, without a trace. When James escaped for the third, and very successful, time, Brennan was helpless. James had planned well. He had learned from his first two efforts. The first escape was a blind run toward a predictable objective, all right, that was a danger to be avoided. His second was entirely successful until James created his own area of danger. Another lesson learned. The third was planned with as much care as Napoleon's deliverance from the island. James had started by choosing his time. He'd waited until Easter week. He'd had a solid 10 days during which he would be only one of countless thousands of children on the streets. There would be no slight suspicion because he was out when others were in. James didn't go to school that day. That was common. Children in the lower grades are often absent, and no one asks a question until they return, with the proper note from the parent. He was not missed anywhere until the school bus that should have dropped him off did not. This was an area of weakness that Brennan could not plug. He could hardly justify the effort of delivering and fetching the lad to and from school when the public school bus passed the Holden home. Brennan relied upon the Mitchells to see James upon the bus and to check him off when he returned. Whether James would have been missed earlier even with a personal delivery is problematical. Certainly James would have had to concoct some other scheme to gain him his hours of free time. At any rate, the first call to the school connected the Mitchells with a grumpy-voiced janitor who growled that teachers and principals had headed for their hills of freedom and wouldn't be back until Monday week. It took some calling to locate a couple of James Holden's classmates who asserted that he hadn't been in school that day. Paul Brennan knew at once what had happened, but he could not raise an immediate hue and cry. He fretted because of the Easter week vacation. In any other time the sight of a school-aged boy free during school hours would have caused suspicion. During Easter week vacation, every schoolboy would be free. James would also be protected by his size. A youngster walking alone is not suspect, his folks must be close by. The fact that it was again placed Paul Brennan in an undesirable position. This was not the youthful adventure that usually ends about 3 blocks from home. This was a repeat of the first absence during which James had been missing for months. People smile at the parents of the child who packs his little bag with a handkerchief and a candy bar to sally forth into the great big world, but it becomes another matter when the lad of 6 leaves home with every appearance of making it stick. So Brennan had to play it cozy, inviting newspaper reporters to the Holden home to display what he had to offer young James and giving them free rein to question Brennan's housekeeper and general factotum, the Mitchells. With honest-looking zeal, Paul Brennan succeeded in building up a picture that depicted James as ungrateful, hard to understand, willful, and something of an intellectual brat. Then the authorities proceeded to throw out a fine mesh dragnet. They questioned and cross-questioned bus drivers and railroad men. They made contact with the local airport even though its facilities were only used for a daisy-cutting feeder line. Posters were printed and sent to all truck lines for display to the truck drivers. The roadside diners were covered thoroughly. And knowing the boy's ability to talk convincingly, the authorities even went so far as to try the awesome project of making contact with passengers bound out of town with young male children in tow. Had James given them no previous experience to think about, he would have been merely considered a missing child and not a deliberate runaway. Then, instead of dragging down all of the known avenues of standard escape, the townspeople would have organized a tree-by-tree search of the fields and woods with hundreds of men walking hand in hand to inspect every square foot of the ground for either tracks or the child himself. But the modus operandi of young James Holden had been to apply sly touches such as writing letters and forging signatures of adults to cause the unquestioned sale of railroad tickets, or the unauthorized ride in the side-door Pullman. Therefore, While the authorities were extending their circle of search based upon the velocity of modern transportation, James Holden was making his slow way across field and stream, guided by a Boy Scout compass and a U.S. Geodetic Survey map to keep him well out of the reach of roadway or town. With difficulty, but with dogged determination, he carried a light cot blanket into which he had rolled 4 cans of pork and beans. He had a Boy Scout knife and a small pair of pliers to open it with. He had matches. He had the Boy Scout handbook, which was doubly useful, the pages devoted to woodsman's lore he kept for reference, the pages wasted on the qualifications for merit badges he used to start fires. He enjoyed sleeping in the open because it was spring and pleasantly warm, and because the Boy Scout manual said that camping out was fun. A grown man with an objective can cover 30 or 40 miles per day without tiring. James made it 10 to 15. Thus, by the time the organized search petered out for lack of evidence and manpower, try asking one question of everybody within a 100-mile radius, James was quietly making his way, free of care, like a hardy pioneer looking for a homestead site. The hint of kidnap went out early. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, of course, could not move until the waiting period was ended, but they did collect information and set up their organization ready to move into high speed at the instant of legal time. But then no ransom letter came, no evidence of the crime of kidnapping. This did not close the case. There were other cases on record where a child was stolen by adults for purposes other than ransom. It was not very likely that a child of 6 would be stolen by a neurotic adult to replace a lost infant, and Paul Brennan was personally convinced that James Holden had enough self-reliance to make such a kidnap attempt fail rather early in the game. He could hardly say so, nor could he suggest that James had indeed run away deliberately and skillfully, and with planned steps worthy of a much older person. He could only hint and urge the FBI into any action that he could coerce them into taking. He did not care how or who brought James back, just so long as the child was returned to his custody. Then, as the days wore into weeks with no sign, the files were placed in the inactive drawer. Paul Brennan made contact with a few private agencies. He was stopped here, again, by another angle. The Holdens were by no means wealthy. Brennan could not justify the offer of some reward so large that people simply could not turn down the slim chance of collecting. If the missing one is heir to a couple of $1 million, the trustees can justify a reward of a good many $1,000s for his return. The amount that Brennan was prepared to offer could not compel the services of a private agency on a full-time basis. The best and the most interested of the agencies took the case on a contingent basis. If something turned their way in the due course of their work, they'd immediately take steps. Solving the case of a complete disappearance on the part of a child who virtually vanished into thin air would be good advertising, but their advertising budget would not allow them to put one man on the case without the first shred of evidence to point the way. If Paul Brennan had been above board, he could have evoked a lot of interest. The search for a 6-year-old boy with the educational development of a youth of about 18, informed through the services of an electromechanical device, would have fired public interest, government intervention, and would also have justified Paul Brennan's depth of interest. But Paul Brennan could say nothing about the excellent training. He could only hint at James Holden's mental proficiency, which was backed up by the boy's school record. As it was, Paul Brennan's most frightful nightmare was one where young James was spotted by some eagle-eyed detective, and then in desperation, anything being better than an enforced return to Paul Brennan, James Holden pulled out all the stops and showed everybody precisely how well educated he really was. In his own affairs, Paul still had to make a living, which took up his time. As guardian and trustee of the Holden estate, he was responsible to the state for his handling of James Holden's inheritance. The state takes a sensible view of the disbursements of the inheritance of a minor. Reasonable sums may be spent on items hardly deemed necessities to the average person, but the ceiling called reasonable is a flexible term and subject to close scrutiny by the state. In the long run, it was Paul Brennan's own indefensible position that made it impossible to prosecute a proper search for the missing James Holden. Brennan suspected James of building up a bank account under some false name, but he could not saunter into banks and ask to examine their records without a court order. Brennan knew that James had not taken off without preparation, but the examination of the stuff that James left behind was not very informative. There was a small blanket missing, and Mrs. Mitchell said that it looked as though some cans had been removed from the stock, but she could not be sure. And in a large collection of boys' stuff, one would not observe the absence of a Boy Scout knife and other trivia. Had a 100% inventory been available, the list of missing items would have pointed out James Holden's avenue of escape. The search for an adult would have included questioning of banks. No one knows whether such a questioning would have uncovered the bank by-mail routine conducted under the name of Charles Maxwell. It is not a regular thing, but the receipt of a check drawn on a New York bank, issued by a publishing company, and endorsed to be paid to the account of so-and-so, accompanied by a request to open an account in that name, might never be connected with the manipulations of a 6-year-old genius, who was overtly just plain bright. And so Paul Brennan worried himself out of several pounds for fear that James would give himself away to the right people. He cursed the necessity of keeping up his daily work routine. The hue and cry he could not keep alive, but he knew that somewhere there was a young boy entirely capable of reconstructing the whole machine that Paul Brennan wanted so desperately that he had killed for it. Paul Brennan was blocked cold. With the FBI maintaining a hands-off attitude because there was no trace of any federal crime involved, the case of James Holden was relegated to the missing persons files. It became the official opinion that the lad had suffered some mishap and that it would only be a matter of time before his body was discovered. Paul Brennan could hardly prove them wrong without explaining the whole secret of James Holden's intelligence, competence, and the certainty that the young man would improve upon both as soon as he succeeded in rebuilding the Holden electromechanical educator. With the FBI out of the picture, the local authorities waiting for the discovery of a small body, and the state authorities shelving the case except for the routine punchcard checks, official action died. Brennan's available reward money was not enough to buy a private agency's interest full-time. Brennan could not afford to tell anybody of his suspicion of James Holden's source of income, for the idea of a child's making a living by writing would be indefensible without full explanation. However, Paul Brennan resorted to reading of magazines edited for boys. Month after month he bought them and read them, comparing the styles of the many writers against the style of the manuscript copy left behind by James. Brennan naturally assumed that James would use a pen name. Writers often used pen names to conceal their own identity for any one of several reasons. A writer might use 3 or more pen names, each one identified with a known style of writing, or a certain subject or established character. But Paul Brennan did not know all there was to know about the pen name business, such as an editor assigning a pen name to prevent the too often appearance of some prolific writer, or conversely to make one writer's name seem exclusive with his magazine, nor could Brennan know that a writer's literary standing can be kept high by assigning a pen name to any second-rate material he may be so unfortunate as to turn out. Paul Brennan read many stories written by James Holden under several names, including the name of Charles Maxwell, but Brennan's identification according to literary style was no better than if he had tossed a coin. And so, blocked by his own guilt and avarice from making use of the legal avenues of approach, Paul Brennan fumed and fretted away 4 long years while James Holden grew from 6 to 10 years old, hiding under the guise of the Hermit of Martin's Hill and behind the pleasant adult facade of Mrs. Janet Bagley.